All right, we asked you, Sports Nation, what's the greatest single game feat? Yeah.
Oh, my goodness. I think it's a landslide.
Kind of what we figured. Wow. There's some little bit of love. 1 out of 10 say Bill Sittler's 10-point night on the ice. But Wilt Chamberlain's 100 points in 1962 takes the cake. And speaking of that, some sports records were perhaps made to never be broken or even approached. One of those may be that number put up by Wilt Chamberlain on March 2nd, 1962, when he scored 100 points in a Philadelphia Warriors win over the Knicks in Hershey, Pennsylvania. Wilt averaged over 50 points a game that season. Our next guest knows that well. Gary Pomerantz has authored a book now out entitled Wilt 1962. I'll hold it up. Not sure if you can see it. I think you can. And Gary, thanks for joining us today on The Pulse. What made you want to write this book in the first place?
Well, first off, let me say you have some very smart viewers there. 78%, they're right on it. Wilt Chamberlain's 100-point game is really the Everest of sports records. It's never been approached. No other player in the NBA has scored 90 or 80 or even 75. The next highest total by a player other than Wilt is 73 in 1978. By Denver's David Thompson. So this record is just looming above all of them.
That night in Hershey, he scored 100. He shot 63 shots, 28 of 32 from the free throw line when he was normally a 50% shooter from there. The score was 169 to 147. The Knicks had 3 30-point scorers and lost. These are all incredible numbers. So when you think about all this, just how momentous was that night when you look at sports history?
Well, I think it's hugely symbolic. You got to realize where the NBA was in those days. Wilt Chamberlain led the movement that changed the way the game was played. He, along with Oscar Robertson and Elgin Baylor and others, took what was pretty much a feet-on-the-floor horizontal game, and they took it vertical above the rim. But also to remember, and this is why Michael Jordan, with all due respect to Michael Jordan, and his legend will stand on its own, he can never be as important historically as Wilt because of the time periods they played. When Wilt came into the NBA in 1957, the great social transformation was underway. The civil rights movement had taken flight. And when he entered the National Basketball Association in 1959, there was unquestionably still a quota that limited the number of African-American players to initially 1 or 2 per team, and later 3 or 4. And I think what Wilt did in 1962, by averaging 50 points a game and scoring 100 against the Knicks in Hershey, was to symbolically blow that quota to smithereens.
Yeah, Gary, I don't know if a lot of our younger viewers really know how much of an impact Wilt Chamberlain had on the game of basketball. I mean, it is a sport that had to change rules to accommodate Wilt Chamberlain or to keep his dominance at a minimum. Talk about some of those rule changes that came along because of this 7'1" Wilt Chamberlain.
And he was the first great big guy athlete. I mean, at 7'1", 265 pounds, he ran the floor like a train, and to hear the players from his generation talk about it, it's much as I imagine they would be like interviewing the Plains Indians about their first sighting of the locomotive. They changed rules in college. They couldn't inbound the ball over the basket. They widened the lane in the NBA for Wilt, as they had in the 50s for Mikan, initially with Mikan from 6 feet to 12, and then Wilt from 12 to 15 feet. And the idea is to move him farther from the basket. But, take it out of the basketball realm, and I think if you look at Wilt Chamberlain, and if you look at pure athleticism as a combination of size and speed, strength and agility, then I think the young Wilt Chamberlain, at 7'1", 265 pounds, a track and field star, and an unparalleled scorer in basketball, might have been the greatest pure athlete of the 20th century. And if not, at the very least, he deserves to be in that conversation.
Well, that leads us nicely to a question that we have. What we like to do here on The Pulse is get our viewers involved and allow them to ask questions. And we've got a camera set up at the ESPN zone in Chicago. That's where we're going to go to our first viewer question for you, Gary.
Hi, this is Howard Darnell from Chicago. I'd like to know how Wilt Chamberlain will be in the NBA today.
How would Wilt Chamberlain be in the NBA today? Well, look, I think greatness, and surely Wilt Chamberlain had greatness as a basketball player, it's timeless. Fred Astaire was a great dancer in his time. He'd be fabulous still today. I think Wilt would more than hold his own today. And, the question often asked is how would Wilt and Shaq have done against each other? I think Shaq would have held him to at least, maybe 98.
All right, Wilt Chamberlain went to school at Kansas, obviously, and then he spent a year with the Harlem Globetrotters, and that is where the women chasing began. Of course, Wilt says he slept with over 20,000 women in his lifetime. How do you think that affects the way America will always remember Wilt Chamberlain?
Well, you know, Wilt Chamberlain died at the age of 63 in 1999 at his home in Bel Air in Southern California. And the shorthand summary to his life now is really two numbers, 20,000 and 100. The 20,000, of course, is, as you say, for his now famous or infamous boast that he'd slept with 20,000 women, and the 100 from his magical night in Hershey. You know, Wilt Chamberlain was afflicted with a Goliath syndrome. He had this nearly obsessive need to prove his greatness in all things, big and small. And so that same need or impulse to score 100 points in a game against the Knicks, to bend not only the Knicks, but really an entire sport to his will, transformed decades later into the need to boast of sexual conquest. And in a sense, it was sad, because in the last few years of his life, it had reduced the great Wilt Chamberlain to parody and caricature. And of course, we can say one number can be proven and the other cannot. But I think as more time passes, the silliness will fade, and he'll be seen in context as the single most transformative player in the game's history.
Yeah, 30 points and 23 rebounds a game, NBA career numbers. Incredible. All right, let's dig back into our mailbag now and hear from another viewer via the email. And Brian in Marion, Ohio wants to know, Gary, what was the most interesting fact you came across while writing this book about Wilt?
Well, there were a lot of interesting facts, but one of them that really intrigued me was the fact that he, in 1962, was the co-owner of a famous landmark Harlem nightclub that dated back to the halcyon days of the Harlem Renaissance. It was then called Small's Paradise, and Wilt's celebrity was so big in 1962, even though he was just 25, that they added his name to the nightclub, and they called it Big Wilt Small's Paradise. And, you know, he moved through that nightclub like he owned all of Harlem, in fact, all of New York. He had Red Fox there, and Cannonball Adderley, and Etta James. That place was hopping. And in fact, after Wilt scored 100 points against the Knicks in Hershey, as if that wasn't hard enough on him, he drove the Knicks' Willie Knowles back home to New York, and Wilt went back to that nightclub to celebrate until the early morning hours.
The book is called Wilt 1962, and if you think you already knew everything about one of basketball's greatest players, you don't. Read this man's book. Gary Pomerantz, great job on the book, and thanks for joining us today on The Pulse.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show.